Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty mind-bending. We're not just questioning, say, the laws of physics as you know them.
No, it's more like we're taking a sledgehammer to the very foundation, isn't it? That basic idea of cause and effect.
Exactly. You drop a ball, it falls.
Yeah.
Simple. You put ice in your drink, it gets cold. We just call that causality. We think of it as this independent, natural thing that just happens.
Right. But what if, and this is the big leap, what if the ball had absolutely zero power in itself to fall? Or the ice was, well, completely inert, possessing no inherent ability, no power to make the drink cold.
That's the radical idea we're tackling today. This notion that the created world, the physical stuff around us, has no efficient power of its own. It's the cornerstone of a philosophical doctrine called occasionalism.
And our mission, our deep dive today, is really to explore this, specifically how it developed within classical Islamic theology. We've been digging into the sources.
Yeah, sources showing why this view, sometimes called divine monotheism, became, well, the orthodox intellectual framework for centuries. We're looking at insights from early theologians right up to the really powerful philosophical arguments of Al-Ghazali. So the core definition, just to be clear, occasionalism is this philosophical theory about causation. It states flatly that created substances, things in the world, cannot be efficient causes of events, cannot be the actual cause.
Exactly. All events, every single one, are taken to be caused directly, immediately by God.
So what we think of as natural causes, they're just occasions.
Precisely. They're merely the occasions for God's action. They aren't the source of the power.
Okay, let's use that classic example you mentioned earlier. A match striking wood.
Right.
The contact between the match and the wood, that's the occasion. But it's God who instantly creates the burning right at that moment.
Yes. The match itself, the physical object, is totally powerless to make anything happen on its own. Its very existence, its properties, they all depend entirely on God's continuous, moment-by-moment creative act.
So if you could somehow, hypothetically remove God's will from the equation for just an instant,
the match would do nothing. It would be completely incapable of producing fire. Occasionalism is a total denial of any intrinsic, necessary power within nature itself.
Everything we perceive, then gravity, heat transfer, chemical reactions, even life. It's all just a sequence of discrete events created one after the other.
Discrete events created by God. That's the core idea.
So where does the philosophical position this dramatic actually come from? It sounds quite radical to modern ears.
It does, but it didn't just appear out of nowhere. The sources we looked at make it really clear that occasionalism, or this divine monotheism view, is actually deeply rooted, implicit even in the central Islamic concept of tawhid.
Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, exactly. The absolute assertion of God's oneness, unity, singularity. Think about it. If God is truly the one and only necessary power, the one and only creator, then giving real independent causal power to anything else, a star, a rock, a law of physics,
that would essentially be elevating creation, wouldn't it? It would compromise God's absolute singularity. It would be a kind of hidden polytheism almost.
So it's a logical requirement flowing directly from the theology of absolute monotheism. Precisely. And you see this captured perfectly in that foundational phrase, something repeated by Muslims for centuries. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power or strength except with Allah.
But the meaning is even deeper, especially when you look at the linguistics. The root of the word hala, it relates specifically to change, transformation, motion, dynamism. Okay. So it's not just about brute strength. The deeper meaning is more like there is no change, no transformation, no power, no motion, except through God.
Yes. It's a powerful theological statement that just negates any independent source of dynamism or change in the entire universe outside of God's direct will.
And what's really fascinating, as you pointed out from the sources, is that this wasn't just, invented whole cloth by later philosophers like Al-Ghazali. Not at all. The principles trace back much earlier. Successive Orthodox theologians were unpacking it, explaining it in more and more detail over time, even before Imam al-Ash'ari in the 10th century.
Like Hassan al-Basri back in the 8th century.
Yeah, figures like Hassan al-Basri, he was already grappling with that tension, the one tension. Occasionalism aims to resolve the tension between human freedom and, divine fate or predestination.
He explored this idea that, maybe man is free in his choices, but the ultimate outcome, the determination of events, that rests solely with God.
That's the kind of thinking that was developing. And even earlier, you start seeing the crucial vocabulary emerge in 8th century Hanafi theological writings.
So even before the major schools were fully solidified.
Right. You see this early rhetoric describing creation's role as acquiring actions, actions which are fundamentally created by Allah. This is where we see the seeds of the term kasb.
Kasb, acquisition, that sounds important. It becomes a key technical term later, doesn't it, for al-Ash'ari and al-Maturidi.
Absolutely key. They formalized it to try and reconcile God's total omnipotence, the idea that he creates everything, with human moral responsibility. Because that's the obvious challenge, right? If God causes everything, how are we responsible for our actions?
Okay, so how does kasb actually work in this view? It sounds like a bit of a paradox. If God creates my action, say me raising my hand,
Yeah.
how do I acquire it?
It's an elegant solution, they argued.
Yeah.
God is the only true agent, the only one with creative power. So the action itself, the physical movement, the changes in muscles and nerves that make your hand rise, that is created by God in that very instant.
Okay.
But for humans to be morally accountable, they have to play some role. Kas, acquisition, is that role. It's about the human's connection to the action.
So God creates the motion, but the human acquires the intention or the choice.
Essentially, yes. The choice, the volition, the intention to move the hand for a specific purpose, maybe to wave hello, or to pick something up that is the human's kas, their acquisition. You will the action, and simultaneously, God creates the action that corresponds to your will.
So I intend to raise my hand. In the very instant I have that intention, God creates the necessary physical changes, the motion, the substance changes for it to happen.
That's the model.
And I'm held accountable for my intention, my volition, and the resulting acquisition of the action, even though I didn't have the ultimate power to create the physical movement itself.
Precisely. It's a profound distinction, separating the creation of the act from the willing or intending of the act.
That makes sense. So this whole trajectory from early discussions about fate through the initial use of terms like cause.
It eventually culminates in the really sophisticated philosophical doctrines of Imams al-Ash'ari and al-Maturidi in the 10th century. These figures essentially cemented the theological orthodoxy for Sunni Islam. And occasionalism became the standard way to understand Tawhid in relation to the created world.
And the sources mention that while they both upheld this core occasionalist view God as the sole true cause, any differences between Ash'ari and Maturidi were often quite subtle, more like differences in expression.
Yes, often very nuanced technical points, maybe slight disagreements on the exact nature of divine attributes or the precise timing or mechanism of kas. But on the fundamental denial of independent causal power in nature, they were unified.
Okay. And this established theological consensus, this denial of natural causes, really sets the stage for Imam al-Ghazali in the 11th century, right?
Right.
And his famous philosophical attack.
Absolutely. When we get to al-Ghazali and his major work, the incoherence of the philosophers, the tahafid al-falasifa, the stakes get even higher. He takes this established theological doctrine of occasionalism and wields it like a weapon.
A weapon against who, exactly?
Against the rationalist philosophers of his time, he launches this devastating logical assault on their metaphysical assumptions, using occasionalism as his foundation.
And this is where, for anyone listening who just takes cause and effect for granted, things get really, really interesting. Al-Ghazali insists God regulates everything, directly, moment by moment. And the denial is absolute, isn't it? Natural causes don't just have less power.
They have zero efficient power, none whatsoever. He directly challenges the very notion of a necessary connection between events.
What the philosophers he was arguing against, the Peripatetics, followers of Aristotle and Plato, through thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Farabi, what did they believe?
They generally asserted that when event A happens, event B must necessarily follow, due to some inherent property or power within nature itself. You know, fire necessarily burns cotton because of the nature of fire and the nature of cotton.
And Al-Ghazali just demolishes this assumption, using logic.
Cold, hard logic. He
That's
makes that famous razor-sharp claim that really defines the whole position. He says something like, the connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary, according to us.
According to us, meaning the occasionalists.
Right. He argues, look, take any two distinct things. Let's call them A and B. The existence or affirmation of A does not logically necessitate the existence or affirmation of B, nor does it necessitate the negation of B.
So just because A happens, you cannot rationally prove with absolute certainty that B must happen next.
Exactly. You can't prove that the existence of the first event requires the second one.
This is such a crucial point. We confuse habit with necessity all the time, don't we?
Constantly. Al-Ghazali points this out. The sun rises every morning. That's a habit, a consistent pattern we observe.
But can I logically prove, based only on the nature of the sun and the earth as I observe them, that the sun must rise tomorrow? That it's a logical impossibility for it not to rise?
Al-Ghazali says absolutely not. Observation only shows us sequence, concomitance, one thing following another. It doesn't show us necessity.
And he uses those really simple, everyday examples.
Shockingly simple yet profound, like quenching thirst and drinking water. We just assume water has some inherent property, some quench thirstiness that necessarily causes the feeling of satisfaction.
But Al-Ghazali says, what do we actually observe?
We observe two distinct events. First, the act of drinking. Second, the feeling of thirst being quenched. There's no observable, necessary link between them. It is God, he argues, who creates the sensation of quenching at the moment of drinking.
So purely from observation, we could logically imagine drinking water and the thirst remaining. Or maybe the water suddenly makes us feel hungry instead.
Logically, yes. The events are distinct. They are not tied together by any observable necessity, only by God's consistent habit of creating one after the other.
And he didn't just limit this to simple examples, did he?
No, he applied it across the board, all connected things. Medicine, the drug, doesn't heal. God creates the healing when the drug is taken. Astronomy, the planets don't move themselves according to fixed laws inherent in them. God creates their motion at every instant. Arts, crafts, everything observable.
So if causality isn't a real force connecting things in the world, what is it? What are we actually perceiving when we see the match light the wood?
According to the occasionalist view, that perceived connection is fundamentally a mental construct. It's a label we apply.
A label based on probability, habit.
Based on observing a consistent sequence, event A happens, then event B happens, again and again. Our minds, our intellects, then attribute a necessary connection, a kind of responsibility linking the two. We infer causality.
So it's all inductive reasoning. Because the sun has risen 1,000,000 times, it's highly probable it will rise again tomorrow. But induction only gives us probability, right? Not logical certainty.
Exactly. And the philosophical standard Al-Ghazali was holding the rationalists to was certainty, demonstrative proof.
The physical events themselves, the match striking, the wood burning, goose, those are real events created by God.
Yes, they are real creations. But the presumed force connecting them, the causality, that's merely probable knowledge derived from habit. It's not certain knowledge derived from reason or direct observation of a necessary link.
Al-Ghazali's genius here was showing that if you apply the philosopher's own rigorous standards of logic, their claims about natural causality actually fail. They can't prove it with certainty.
Which leaves the door open, logically, only for the continuous, certain creative act of God as the real explanation for why things happen.
It's really important, though, to understand Al-Ghazali's goal here, isn't it? His big project in the Tafut, the incoherence. It wasn't really an attack on, say, doing science or observing the world carefully.
Not at all. It was a highly strategic theological defense. His main target wasn't physics, the study of the natural world. It was metaphysics.
He was going after those specific philosophical schools.
Primarily the Mu'tazila, who were rationalist theologians, and the Islamic peripatetics, the Falasifa, like Avicenna, who had deeply integrated Greek, specifically new Platonist and Aristotelian frameworks into their worldview.
And the problem with those frameworks, from Al-Ghazali's perspective,
they tended to elevate human reason and the logical structures derived from it, like necessary natural causality above divine revelation. They built entire theological systems based on what they thought reason could deduce about God and the world.
So Al-Ghazali basically turned their own favorite tool, rational logic, against them. He said, okay, you philosophers claim nature runs on necessary inherent laws. Prove it. Logically.
And then he demonstrated point by point why their proofs didn't hold up to logical certainty, why observation only shows sequence, not necessity.
And by knocking down their confidence in reason's ability to establish natural causality, he systematically undermined the foundation of their whole rationalist theological project. The implication was powerful. If your reason fails you on something as basic as explaining why fire burns, how can you possibly claim human reason is the ultimate authority on complex theological matters like the nature of God's attributes, creation, the afterlife? So the occasionalist argument, at its heart, is really a critique of epistemology, about how we know things and how we interpret what our senses tell us.
Yes, fundamentally. Our brain, Al-Ghazali would argue, is itself a natural system. It operates within the world God creates moment by moment, and it has this built-in instinct, you could say, to interpret repetitive sensory inputs, seeing A, always followed by B, as evidence of a necessary causal link.
It sees the pattern and assumes an unbreakable law connects the dots.
But that instinct, that initial interpretation, is deceptive according to occasionalism. If you reflect deeply, philosophically, on what sensory input actually gives you, it only gives you correlation sequence, not necessity.
So the skepticism isn't really aimed at the idea of necessary connection itself.
No, because they absolutely believe in a necessary connection, the connection between God's will and his creation. The skepticism is aimed at the misinterpretation of sensory data by the human mind. The mind sees order and regularity, God's consistent habit, and mistakenly attributes inherent power to the created objects themselves.
Okay, this feels like the right moment to bring in the underlying metaphysical structure that actually makes this constant divine action plausible. The Asherite doctrine of atomism.
Yes, atomism is crucial. It's the bedrock. This isn't quite the atomism of modern chemistry, though. It's a metaphysical theory about the fundamental nature of reality.
It's the engine that makes occasionalism run, essentially.
You could put it that way. It provides the mechanism for God's constant direct control. In Asherite atomism, reality isn't a continuous flow. It's composed of these indivisible elementary particles or substances. They call them jawar.
Substances, like the fundamental stuff of reality.
Right. But these substances, these jawar, can exist on their own. They only exist together with transient qualities or properties, things like color, heat, position, motion, even the state of being connected or separate. These are called arad, accidents.
Accidents. Okay. And the absolutely crucial point here, the linchpin, is about how long these accidents last.
Exactly. They don't endure. They have no subsistence, no staying power of their own. According to the doctrine, all arad exist for only a single, indivisible instant of time.
One instant.
One instant. They are constantly, perpetually being created and annihilated by God.
Moment to moment.
To moment.
Wow. So the world isn't like a smooth, continuous movie film.
It's more like a digital screen being refreshed incredibly rapidly, or maybe like individual frames in an animation, each one drawn completely anew by God.
So if I'm looking at, say, red apple, the appleness, the substance, jawar, might persist for a bit, but the redness, that specific quality,
is an arid, an accident created by God right now. In the very next instant, that specific instance of redness is annihilated, and God recreates a new, identical instance of redness in the same substance.
So the apple appears continuously red, but metaphysically, it's a constant flicker of creation and annihilation of that property.
That's the idea. This constant renewal, this perpetual creation and destruction of both substances, and especially their accidents, ensures that nothing in the physical world has any inherent power to last, let alone to cause something else.
All the power, all the persistence we perceive is actually just God's continuous act of recreation at this fundamental atomic level.
He is the only true agent, the only power, constantly sustaining and refreshing the universe.
So going back to the fire example, at no point does the fire itself sustain the burning through its own power.
Correct. Rather, God creates the accident of contact between match and wood. Then he creates the accident of fire associated with the match substance. Then he creates the accidents of heat and being consumed, or ash, in the wood substance instant by instant in a consistent sequence.
In the appearance of a necessary sequence, the law of burning is simply the result of God consistently choosing to create these accidents in that specific order. His habit.
Precisely. This atomistic view, with its instantaneous accidents, is really the only way to logically uphold both absolute tawhid, God's sole power, and occasionalism. If substances or accidents could endure on their own, even for a short time, they would possess some measure of independence, some inherent power, which would violate God's absolute singularity as the only source of power and change.
Okay, now this leads us to what might be the most surprising twist for a modern listener. This whole framework denying natural necessity, insisting on moment-to-moment divine creation, it seems like it would stifle scientific inquiry, right?
You'd think so. It sounds completely counter to the modern scientific mindset, which relies on stable, predictable natural laws.
But the sources argue the opposite, that this theology actually fueled scientific advancement, specifically the development of rigorous empiricism.
It sounds paradoxical, but yes, the logic actually holds together quite well. Think about the Asherite emphasis on what they called necessary knowledge.
Necessary knowledge, what do they mean by that?
Knowledge that comes directly and involuntarily from the functioning of our senses. You open your eyes in a lit room, you cannot choose not to see the large object right in front of you. That sensory input provides necessary, certain knowledge of the sensation itself.
Okay, so the raw sense data is considered certain. You can't doubt that you are experiencing seeing red or feeling heat.
Exactly. Now, combine that with the skepticism about causal connections. If you can't trust that A necessarily causes B just because you see them happen together,
then you have to become incredibly careful and methodical about observing A and observing B and documenting the sequence, right? You can only trust the direct observations.
precisely. It forces you towards a rigorous empirical method. Since the link between events is suspect, it's just God's habit, you must focus intensely on meticulously observing the events themselves.
And this need for methodological rigor, the sources say, is perfectly exemplified by scientists who came out of this Asharite tradition, like Ibn al-Haytham.
Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Hazan in the West, is the prime example, a towering figure in the history of optics and science generally. He operated within this intellectual environment.
And he famously challenged the old Greek ideas about vision, didn't he? The idea that light rays shoot out from the eye.
He did. That was largely a rationalist assumption based on how perception felt. Ibn al-Haytham rejected it based on empirical testing. He argued and demonstrated through experiments that light rays actually enter the eye from the object, that they travel in straight lines, and he even theorized light consisted of discrete particles.
And his methods were key. He didn't just speculate, he tested.
His methodology was revolutionary. He systematically divorced observation from pure rationalist speculation. His famous camera obscura experiments are a perfect case study.
The pinhole camera, essentially.
Right. By setting a controlled, repeatable experiments, observing how light behaved when passing through a small aperture, he could gather evidence and prove his hypotheses about light transmission and vision.
So this meticulous gathering of evidence, through experiments and careful observation, it actually validated the Asharite skepticism. Skepticism about just relying on initial perception or philosophical assumptions about how things must work.
Exactly. If you're already philosophically skeptical that your immediate gut feeling about causality, fire makes things burn, reveals the true underlying mechanism,
then you're forced to design experiments, to isolate variables, to carefully document the sequence of events, the habit of creation, without assuming an inherent power link. You're pushed towards becoming a methodologist.
Yes. The philosophy encouraged making a sharp distinction. On one hand, you have the uniformity of nature, as our brains perceive it, that consistent pattern, which is simply God's custom, Ada. On the other hand, you have the actual metaphysical mechanism, which is constant divine creation.
And our brain, being itself part of nature, created moment by moment.
It has to work by predicting patterns, by positing cause and effect just to function, to navigate the world. But deep philosophical reflection, combined with rigorous empirical testing like Ibn al-Haytham's, shows that this mental projection of causality is an intellectual habit, a useful tool for prediction perhaps, but not a reflection of inherent necessary power in objects.
There's a distinction here between the mind as the subject observing and nature as the object being observed. But in Asharite thought, they're kind of the same stuff, right?
Fundamentally, yes. The mind, the brain, the senses, they are all part of nature, composed of those substances, jawar, and accidents, arad, being constantly created by God.
So the mind perceives this uniformity that God creates and interprets it as necessary causality.
But rigorous empirical work, like Ibn al-Haytham's optics, demonstrated that while our initial raw sensory perception can sometimes be misleading about how things work, a careful, methodical, empirical approach can reliably document the consistent sequence, the habit of God's creation.
Which allows for reliable science, for prediction, even for engineering, without ever needing to believe in independent natural powers or necessary causal links between created things.
The ultimate necessary connection is reserved solely for God's will. Observing nature becomes the process of documenting the highly consistent, reliable sequence of God's discrete creative acts. The more rigorously you observe, the more accurately you map out that divine habit.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've journeyed through a pretty radical idea, occasionalism, emerging from the heart of Islamic monotheism, Tawhid.
It provided, arguably, the most logically consistent way to maintain God's absolute singular power, denying any real causal power to creation, while, perhaps paradoxically, validating and even encouraging careful empirical observation of the world.
It fundamentally replaces that Greek idea of inherent necessary laws within nature.
With the idea of absolute divine consistency, God's reliable habit.
And this consistency, this Ada or customary way of God, is crucial. The world appears stable and operates according to reliable patterns, not because atoms and forces have their own internal rules.
But because God has decreed the world and continues to decree it moment by moment according to a highly reliable, consistent pattern or habit. Which brings us back to that really pressing challenge for anyone listening. If there's no necessary connection, if gravity isn't an inherent force, how is the universe stable? Why doesn't my coffee cup just float away when I put it down? The stability we observe is entirely dependent on God's continuous will, his decree the amorous. There isn't some independent law of physics holding the cup down or ensuring gravity works tomorrow morning. Instead, there is God's continuous act, creating the cup substance, creating the table substance, creating the accident of downward motion or rest for the cup, creating the accident of resistance in the table, all at every single instant. The overwhelming appearance of stability is, in this view, not evidence of inert physical laws, but powerful evidence of God's unwavering commitment to consistency in his creative habit.
And it's precisely because God's habit is so incredibly consistent and predictable that we can do science.
Yeah.
We can make accurate predictions. We can build bridges in computers. We are, in effect, documenting the infallible patterns in God's moment-to-moment creation.
And there's one final, really powerful implication of this doctrine. It perfectly protects the theological possibility, even necessity, of miracles.
Ah, right. Because if natural laws were truly necessary and independent of God,
Then a miracle, by definition an event that breaks or suspends a natural law, would be a logical impossibility. It would mean the physical world had some power that could defy God, or that God would be contradicting his own necessary creation.
But under occasionalism, the so-called laws of physics aren't necessary internal principles. They're simply God's current, consistent commands or habits, Oda.
Exactly. So a miracle is simply an instance where God chooses, for a specific purpose, to break his usual habit, to create a sequence of events differently.
Like causing fire to be cool for Abraham, or parting the sea for Moses.
Precisely. It demonstrates vividly that the laws are entirely subservient to his will. They are his deterministic commands, not independent forces he has to obey.
And this ability to suspend the usual order is theologically crucial, isn't it? Because prophets, those claiming divine revelation, often needed miracles, empirically verifiable breaks in the normal pattern to validate their message.
Yes, the sources emphasize this. Occasionalism ensures God remains utterly sovereign over the very fabric of reality, fully capable of altering the sequence of created substances and accidents at any instant. He wills, whether according to habit or extraordinarily.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a truly provocative thought, doesn't it? Next time you watch water boil or see the sunrise or drop a pen.
You're not just observing a mundane effect caused by some impersonal energy or force.
You are, from this perspective, observing a moment-to-moment continuous miracle of divine consistency. Every single predictable event of the universe becomes an affirmation of an absolute, ongoing creative will.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into causality, power, and the nature of reality itself.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we are tackling, well, a philosophical concept so radical it really challenges everything we think we know about science, about cause and effect, even just everyday reality.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're diving deep into occasionalism.
It really is the ultimate metaphysical shocker, as you put it. Occasionalism puts forward this absolutely breathtaking idea, the cause and effect we see all the time, like fire burning cotton. Or, say, pressing the brake in the car stopping.
Yeah, basic physics.
Well, occasionalism says those aren't necessary connections at all. They are inherent. They're just the occasion, the trigger, if you will, for the one true cause, God, to step in and act directly to create the effect.
So the physical world is
Right.
like divine software constantly being updated.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. Updated moment by moment directly by God.
Wow. That is a staggering position, especially, think about the time, 17th, 18th century Europe. They're just starting to really embrace this mechanical view of the universe.
Right. The scientific revolution is winding down. The Enlightenment is getting going.
So our mission today is to trace how this idea, occasionalism, had this surprising, really powerful surge in Western thought back then. We'll look at the key players, Malebranche, Berkeley, Hume. We definitely need to contrast their approach with the much earlier Islamic occasionalism, which was maybe more robust, more scripturally grounded.
Absolutely. And we need to figure out why this idea kind of fizzled out in Europe eventually, but also, crucially, how it left this profound philosophical legacy. I mean, a legacy that arguably shaped modern science itself.
That's the really fascinating part. And you mentioned the context, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Not at all.
It crops up, like you said, late scientific revolution, early Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And it becomes this, you could almost call it a thinking man's theology. It offered a really sophisticated way for intellectuals to think about God's constant involvement in the world.
An alternative to what, exactly?
Well, particularly an alternative to pantheism, the idea that God is everything, that the universe itself is divine. That was often seen as, frankly, a much bigger problem, a bigger heresy within Christian culture, which really valued the idea of a transcendent God separate from creation.
Ah, okay. So occasionalism let you keep a God who is both all-powerful and involved, but still distinct from the world he created.
Precisely. It maintained that transcendence while affirming God's immediate presence and power in every single event, a way to resolve some tricky philosophical problems without giving up core theological beliefs.
Okay, so it's trying to square that circle. Let's unpack this. And I think you're right. We have to start where this idea was really hammered out with intense rational argument centuries before Descartes even enters the picture. We need to go back to the Islamic world.
Yeah, absolutely. To really get why the European occasionalists struggled and maybe where they fell short, you have to look back to the 11th century and this just towering figure in philosophy and theology, Al-Ghazali. His work really changed the game.
Al-Ghazali. And his famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa. That wasn't just some dry academic text, was it? It sounds like it caused quite a stir.
Oh, it was a major intellectual event. What's brilliant is how he used reason itself, the very tool the philosophers he was critiquing prized so highly, to systematically pick apart their arguments. He was specifically targeting the influence of, well, foreign metaphysical ideas, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism that had become popular among some Islamic philosophers. Avicenna is probably the most famous example.
And what was the core issue? What were these philosophers arguing that Al-Ghazali objected to so strongly?
Their main idea, drawing from Aristotle, was that nature operates according to its own inherent necessary laws, independent of God's continuous moment-by-moment will. You know, the idea that things have internal natures. Fire burns because it's the nature of fire to burn. It has that power within itself.
Right. A self-sufficient natural order.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali saw this as a huge problem. He argued it fundamentally limited God's absolute power, his omnipotence, his ability to create and change things instantaneously.
So how did he argue against it? What was his counter-argument?
His foundational move was this incredibly rigorous denial of any necessary connection between two distinct things or events. He used these now classic examples, you know, drinking water and thirst being quenched.
Okay.
Or more graphically, a knife cutting off a head and death resulting.
Right.
And the most famous one, fire touching cotton and the cotton burning.
So walk us through the fire and cotton example. What's the logic?
The logic is, look, fire is one thing, cotton is another. They're distinct substances. Therefore, the existence of the fire doesn't logically necessitate the burning of the cotton. And the non-existence of the fire doesn't necessitate the non-burning of the cotton.
Meaning, God could intervene.
Precisely. God could, in theory, bring fire and cotton together and prevent the burning. Think of the Quranic story of Abraham being thrown into the fire but not being burned. Or, conversely, God could make the cotton burn without any fire present at all.
Because God is the only true cause.
That's the absolute core for Al-Ghazali. Anything that happens solely because of the direct, singular will and act of the Creator. There are no secondary, independent causes with their own power. He basically showed that human reason alone, because it's fallible, couldn't be used to box God in, to limit his power based on our observations of how things usually happen.
And this gave Islamic occasionalism a really solid foundation.
Immensely solid. It was grounded in theology, supported by scripture, God as the sole active agent. This provided a kind of stability, a theological bedrock that, frankly, the later European occasionalists didn't have. They were coming at it from a different angle.
Right. So when the Europeans start wrestling with similar ideas centuries later, they aren't starting from this position of established theological strength. They're actually trying to clean up a philosophical mess left by their own foundational figure, Descartes.
Exactly. The infamous mind-body problem. Descartes, split reality into these two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. Mind, res cogitans, thinking, non-physical, non-extended substance, and body, res extensa, physical, extended, non-thinking substance.
Two completely separate realms, no overlap.
Ontologically distinct, yeah. Nothing in common. which immediately creates the problem. Okay, if they're so different, how on earth do they interact? How does my non-physical decision to lift my arm, an event in my mind, cause my physical arm to actually move?
The million-dollar question. And Descartes himself struggled with it, right? Didn't he suggest the pineal gland or something?
He did, yeah. He sort of vaguely located the interaction point in the pineal gland and the brain, but... Well, nobody really bought that. It felt like an ad hoc fix. It didn't really solve the conceptual problem of how two totally different substances could possibly influence each other.
So this huge philosophical puzzle is just sitting there?
And occasionalism steps into that vacuum with this incredibly clean, if radical, solution. They don't interact. Not directly.
Mind doesn't move body, body doesn't cause sensations in the mind.
Nope. God mediates all of it. My intention, my will to move my arm, that's just the occasion for God to then directly cause my physical arm to move. The light hitting my eye, that's the occasion for God to create the sensation of sight in my mind.
God as the universal middleman, the ultimate interface.
Pretty much. And the figure who really took this idea and ran with it in the West, who built a whole system around it, was Nicolas Malebranche.
Malebranche,
Yeah.
a French Catholic priest, right.
Yeah.
Active around the late 17th, early 18th century.
That's him. 1638 to 1715. And he's definitely considered the main proponent, the chief Western occasionalist. What he was explicitly trying to do was synthesize Descartes' new mechanical philosophy with the deeply theological views of St. Augustine, particularly Augustine's emphasis on God's absolute power and presence in the world.
So he saw Descartes' philosophy as useful, but needing a theological upgrade to make it compatible with Augustine.
Exactly. He wanted to make Cartesianism rigorously Christian, you could say.
Yeah.
And his core claim became the defining statement of Western occasionalism. There is only one true cause because there is only one true God.
Okay.
All natural causes are not true causes, but only occasional causes. He was basically applying Al-Ghazali's critique of natural causation directly to solve Descartes' mind-body interaction problem.
It's elegant, in a way. But I seem to remember it attracted some pretty strong criticism, even from people who agreed there was a problem with interaction. Leibniz, for instance.
Yes, Leibniz, a brilliant contemporary. He agreed with Malebranche that direct interaction between mind and body as distinct substances was deeply problematic. But he offered a completely different solution: pre-established harmony.
Right, and this is where we get that famous critique of Malebranche's view, the unskillful watchmaker. Let's unpack that comparison. It really clarifies the difference.
Okay, so Malebranche's view requires God to be constantly, actively involved, moment by moment. Leibniz used the analogy of two clocks. Imagine two perfect clocks, side by side, keeping exact time together.
Okay.
For Malebranche, it's as if every time the hand moves on clock A, say the mind willing something, God has to manually intervene to move the hand on clock B, the body acting to keep them synchronized. God is constantly adjusting, constantly stepping in.
Hence the unskillful watchmaker. God built a universe, a set of clocks that needs constant tinkering, endless miracles, just to keep working properly.
That was Leibniz's critique, yes. He thought it made God seem, well, not omnipotent enough to get it right the first time.
So what was Leibniz's alternative, the pre-established harmony?
Leibniz said, no, God is the perfect watchmaker. He created the clocks, mind and body, so perfectly from the very beginning, and set them in motion with such supreme skill that they run in perfect harmony forever, without any need for further intervention. They only appear to influence each other because their actions are perfectly synchronized by God's initial design.
Like two predetermined parallel tracks that just happen to match up perfectly at every point.
Exactly. So both systems preserve God's power, but in different ways. Malebranche needs continuous divine action, endless creation maintaining the world. Leibniz needs one supreme act of perfect creation that sets everything up in advance. That need for constant, active divine intervention is really the heart of the occasionalist worldview.
Okay, so Malebranche denied that physical things could cause anything, but he still believed physical things actually existed, right? They were real substances, just passive ones.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Matter was real for Malebranche, just causally inert. But then along comes George Berkeley, an Anglican bishop, active a bit later, late 17th into the mid-18th century. And he looked at the situation and basically decided, you know what? The only way to truly protect God's power and solve these philosophical problems is to get rid of matter altogether.
Whoa. So he takes it a step further. It's not just that matter can't cause things, it's that matter doesn't even exist independently.
Precisely. This is subjective idealism. Berkeley's famous Latin phrase sums it up: esse est percipi.
To be is to be perceived.
Exactly. For Berkeley, the world isn't made of physical stuff. It's made entirely of ideas. These ideas exist either in finite minds like ours or, crucially, in the infinite mind of God. There's no such thing as unthinking, unperceived, independent matter just floating around out there.
Okay, let's make this concrete for people listening. If I get up and leave this room, the chair I was sitting on,
Yeah.
what happens to it? Malebranche would say it still exists, God keeps it existing.
Yeah.
What does Berkeley say?
Berkeley says the chair continues to exist because God is perceiving it. God is the ultimate perceiver, the guarantor of reality. He is constantly holding the idea of the chair, and indeed the whole universe, in his mind. And he is the one impressing these ideas, the idea of the chair, the feeling of its texture, its color, onto our finite minds.
So God is like the grand impresario of reality, constantly projecting the world onto our consciousness.
That's a great way to put it. It's the most extreme form of occasionalism you can imagine. Why? Because ideas clearly can't cause other ideas. My idea of hitting a billiard ball can't cause the idea of another billiard ball moving. And think about our senses. We don't choose what we see or hear, right? It feels involuntary.
I open my eyes and I just see the room. I don't decide to construct it.
Exactly. So Berkeley argues since ideas can't cause ideas and our perceptions are involuntary, the only possible cause for the entire stream of experiences we call reality must be God, continuously providing these ideas to us.
Well, it's logically neat. It certainly solves the mind-body problem by just getting rid of the body. But you mentioned earlier that this move, eliminating matter, drew some pretty sharp criticism, especially if you look at it from the perspective of that earlier Islamic occasionalism. What were the main problems people saw?
Yeah, the source material we're drawing on points out some really significant issues, both logical and theological. The first one is just, well, why? Why would God do it this way?
What do you mean?
If God is all-powerful, perfect, why go to the immense trouble of creating this incredibly detailed, consistent illusion of a material world if it only exists as ideas and minds? The earlier occasionalists, like al-Ghazali, accepted the reality of physical substances, even if they denied their causal power. They'd argue you can't just dismiss the existence of matter based on human reasoning alone. Berkeley's position seems to make God into a sort of cosmic deceiver, creating this elaborate sensory show that doesn't correspond to any underlying physical reality, it seems. Inefficient, almost.
Inefficient creation. Doesn't sound like a perfect creator. Okay, what else?
The second critique is arguably much more devastating, especially theologically. It's the problem of other minds.
If my reality is just ideas that God puts in my mind,
then how can you logically prove that anyone else, me, your family, anyone you talk to, is anything more than just another sophisticated set of ideas God is projecting specifically for you?
I have no way of knowing if you're a conscious mind like me or just part of the divine simulation.
Exactly. The Berkeleyan idealist is logically trapped in solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is sure to exist. And think about why that's such a massive problem for monotheistic religions like Christianity or Islam.
Well, yeah, they're all about community, relationships, prophets, scripture delivered through other people.
Right. Both traditions revolve around relationships with other minds, prophets transmitting revelation, the community of believers, ethical duties towards your neighbor. These relationships are seen as essential, often the very medium through which one relates to God. If you can't even be sure other minds exist, the entire social and ethical structure of the religion just collapses.
The whole thing becomes a private show between me and God.
Pretty much. And there's a further theological worry: anthropomorphism.
Making God too much like a human.
Yeah. By reducing God's creative act primarily to generating ideas and perceptions functions we associate with human minds, Berkeley risks making God seem like just a really big mind. It potentially divides God conceptually into God's mind and God's power, undermining the absolute simplicity and oneness tawhid in Islam that's so central. Even deists who just saw God as a creator who then stepped back arguably had a more unified concept of God in some ways.
So in trying to solve Descartes' problem and exalt God's power, Berkeley kind of backed himself into some serious theological corners. The Western version, maybe lacking that strong scriptural anchor, started to drift into philosophically problematic territory.
That seems to be the argument, yeah. The focus shifted heavily towards solving the philosophical puzzle, perhaps at the expense of broader theological coherence that earlier occasionalists had maintained.
Okay, so we have Malebranche saying matter exists but can't cause things, and Berkeley saying matter doesn't even exist, only ideas caused by God. This increasing doubt about the physical world and its powers seems to set the stage perfectly for the next major figure, David Hume.
Absolutely. Hume, the great Scottish skeptic of the 18th century, arrives on the scene, looks at all this debate about causality, and basically takes the occasionalists' own arguments.
And uses them to blow up the whole thing.
Pretty much. He takes their careful analysis of natural cause and effect, agrees with their conclusion that we can't observe any necessary connection, but then he does something radically different. He strips out God as the explanation.
So he keeps the skepticism, but ditches the divine solution.
Exactly. The source material points out quite strongly that Hume's famous critique of causality is, in many ways, a parroting of the occasionalists who came before him. He uses the same kind of examples, like the billiard balls.
Right, the classic Hume example. One ball hits another, the second one moves.
And Hume says, just like Al-Ghazali and Malebranche did, what do we actually observe here? We see contiguity, the balls touch. We see priority, the first ball moves before the second one does. We see constant conjunction. This happens every time we try it. But do we ever actually perceive the power, the force, the necessary connection that makes the second ball have to move?
No, we just see the sequence of events.
Correct. So Hume argues, because we see A followed by B over and over again, our minds develop a habit, an expectation. We project that expectation onto the world and call it causation. But it's fundamentally just a feeling, a mental attribution, an imagining, as he puts it. It's not something inherent in the objects themselves.
Okay, so far he sounds remarkably like the occasionalists. Where's the massive split?
Here's the crucial difference, the philosophical pivot. The occasionalists, Al-Ghazali, Malebranche, they looked at this lack of observable necessary connection in nature and said, aha, this proves that natural things can't be the real cause. Therefore, the real necessary cause must be God, acting directly.
They use skepticism of nature to affirm divine power.
Precisely. Hume takes the exact same skepticism about natural causes and uses it to deny both natural causation and divine causation. He essentially says, if we can't observe necessary connection anywhere, then we have no grounds to assume it exists anywhere, including in some unobservable divine will.
Wow. Okay, so he universalizes the doubt.
He does, and this, according to the source material we're looking at, is where Hume makes a fundamental logical error. It's identified as an inductive fallacy.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Hume, the great empiricist, committing an inductive fallacy. How does that work? Inductive reasoning is based on observation, right?
It is, and Hume is masterful at using induction to show that from our observations of the physical world, what he calls matters of fact, we can never logically derive necessary connections. We only see contingent events, things that could have been otherwise. Fire usually burns cotton, but we can imagine it not burning. That part is correct and mirrors the occasionalists. The fallacy, the source argues, comes when Hume inductively generalizes this conclusion, derived from observing contingent physical events, and applies it to all possible types of causation, including the potential actions of an eternal, omnipotent creator.
Why is that a fallacy? If we can't see the mechanism in physics, why should we assume we know the mechanism in theology? Hume even argued we're profoundly ignorant of how a supreme mind would operate.
But that's exactly the occasionalist point. The two types of causation operate on entirely different levels of necessity. Physical causation, as observed, is contingent. It happens, but we can conceive of it not happening. Divine creation, however, if it exists, is asserted by the occasionalist to be necessary by definition.
What do you mean necessary by definition?
The occasionalist argues, if an omnipotent creator wills something into existence, or wills an effect to occur, like the second billiard ball moving, that thing necessarily comes into existence or that effect necessarily occurs. It's conceptually incoherent for them to imagine God willing something and it failing to happen. That would contradict the definition of omnipotence. Divine will, unlike physical processes, carries inherent necessity.
I see. So Hume's mistake in this view is assuming that the rules and limitations we discover by observing contingent physical events must also apply to the non-observable, potentially necessary act of divine creation. He's applying a conclusion from one domain, the physical observable, to a completely different domain, the metaphysical unobservable, where it might not fit.
Exactly. He takes the limits of human empirical observation and wrongly assumes they are the limits of reality itself, including potential divine action. And Hume's argument about our ignorance of God's workings, the occasionalist flips it.
How so?
Hume says, we're ignorant of how God works, so we can't posit divine causation. the occasionalist says, precisely because we see no necessary causes in nature, and we are ignorant of any other ultimate cause, our very ignorance points us towards positing God, the only conceivable source of necessary causation, as the ultimate explanation. It's the only way to stop the infinite regress of what caused that.
So it's the same starting point, the lack of observable necessary connection leading to diametrically opposite conclusions. Occasionalist. Nature fails, therefore God. Hume. Nature fails, therefore we know nothing for sure about any ultimate cause, natural or divine.
That's a perfect summary of the split. Hume brilliantly wields the occasionalist's analytical tools, the skepticism about nature, but then discards the metaphysical conclusion, God as the necessary cause, that the occasionalist believed those tools logically demanded.
Okay, so occasionalism, particularly Malebranche's version, seems like a really clever, logically consistent way to solve the mind-body problem while keeping God central and all-powerful. Why didn't it stick? Why wasn't it more successful in Europe, especially compared to how influential it was for centuries in Islamic thought?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It had philosophical elegance, but it ran into some really significant roadblocks in the European context. There were deep-seated constraints, both metaphysical and theological, that ultimately made it a non-starter for the wider culture.
What was the biggest hurdle?
Probably the lack of clear, unambiguous scriptural support within the Christian tradition. Unlike the Muslim occasionalists, who could point to passages in the Quran emphasizing God's absolute moment-by-moment creation and power, and rejecting any partners or independent forces alongside God, European thinkers didn't really have that explicit textual bedrock for this specific doctrine.
So without that clear scriptural mandate, it felt more like a philosophical theory, maybe even a bit out there, not grounded in core religious teaching.
Exactly. It seemed like an invention of theologians or philosophers trying to solve a philosophical problem rather than a direct interpretation of revealed truth. And that made it a much harder sell. Plus, they were fighting against centuries of ingrained thinking.
You mean Aristotle?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Aristotelian inertia was huge. European thought for centuries had been deeply steeped in the Aristotelian metaphysical framework. And that framework included the idea of secondary causation, that objects do possess inherent natures and powers. Fire burns, rocks fall, things have capacities. It was just common sense baked into the philosophical system.
And occasionalism asks you to throw all that out.
Completely. To accept occasionalism meant abandoning this familiar idea of secondary causes and believing that literally every single event, every leaf falling, every heartbeat, every thought was a direct individual miracle performed by God in that instant. That required a massive intellectual leap, a complete restructuring of how you saw the world. Secondary causation was just simpler, less disruptive to the established way of thinking.
It sounds intellectually demanding, but you also mentioned a theological burden, beyond just the conceptual difficulty.
Oh, definitely. Think about the personal spiritual implications. If God is literally the only cause of everything, including your own continued existence from one moment to the next.
Then you owe God gratitude, constantly.
Constantly. And consciously. You should, in theory, be aware of and thankful for God's direct action in every single breath you take, every perception you have, the sun rising, your food digesting. It demands this incredibly intense moment-by-moment awareness of total dependence.
That sounds exhausting.
It is.
So a combination of lacking clear scriptural backing, fighting against Aristotelian common sense, and imposing a heavy theological burden meant it just didn't gain widespread traction.
That seems to be the consensus, yeah. It remained largely a theory debated among philosophers and theologians, never really capturing the popular imagination or displacing the older models.
Okay, so occasionalism itself fades in Europe, but its impact doesn't disappear. The skepticism it unleashed, particularly through Hume, couldn't just be ignored, which brings us to Immanuel Kant.
Right. Kant is, in large part, writing in response to Hume. Hume's skepticism, especially about causality and induction, was seen as a potential disaster for science, for reason itself. If we can't be sure cause and effect are real, how can we do science? How can we trust our own reasoning? Kant felt he had to rescue knowledge from this skeptical abyss.
And how did he try to do that? Hume said causality is just a mental habit based on observation. How did Kant try to make it necessary again?
Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy was to turn the focus inward. He argued that certain fundamental structures of experience, like space, time, and crucially, causality, are not things we discover out there in the world through observation. Instead, they are a priori structures within our own minds.
A priori meaning before experience, innate.
Exactly. He called them forms of intuition, space, time, and categories of the understanding, like causality. Think of them like built-in software or inescapable lenses through which our minds must process all incoming sensory data. We can't not experience the world in terms of space, time, and cause and effect because that's how our minds are wired to make sense of anything at all.
So we experience causality as necessary, not because the external world is necessarily causal. Kant famously said we can never know the thing in itself, reality as it truly is, but because our minds impose that causal structure onto whatever sensations we receive.
That's the core idea. He saved necessity, but he relocated it from the external object to the internal subject to the structure of the mind itself. It's a necessary feature of how we perceive, not necessarily how things are.
A very clever move. But the source material makes an interesting comment here, suggesting that maybe Kant's solution wasn't as revolutionary as it seemed compared to earlier traditions.
Yeah, it's a provocative point. The source notes that Kant's big move arguing that the mind, the subject, isn't just passively receiving data from nature, the object, but actively structures our experience of nature shows, in a way, how 18th century European philosophy was still grappling with distinctions that some earlier schools had perhaps handled differently.
How so? What did the earlier schools do?
Well, think about the Stoics, or again, the Asherite Muslim occasionalists. They already had sophisticated ways of thinking about the relationship between the perceiving mind and the external world within a divine framework. They understood the mind as part of the natural order, processing perceptions according to its created nature under God's ultimate authority. Kant's idea that the mind imposes universal necessary laws like causality onto experience was, from this perspective, perhaps a complex way to solve a problem that earlier systems, which didn't separate mind and divinely ordained nature so rigidly, might have addressed more directly. It's a suggestion that maybe Kant was still working within the confines of the Cartesian split in a way earlier thinkers weren't.
Interesting. So even as Europe moved past occasionalism, the philosophical ripples continued and maybe didn't represent a clean break from older ways of thinking. But despite occasionalism's brief lifespan in Europe, its overall impact was huge, right? You mentioned these thinkers are studied more now than ever.
Oh, absolutely disproportionate. It was a short burst, but incredibly bright. Malebranche, Berkeley, Hume, these aren't obscure figures. They are central to the history of Western philosophy. And as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy points out, a key reason they're studied so intensely today is precisely because of their role in developing the skeptical arguments, particularly Hume's, that dismantled classical assumptions and paved the way for modern thought.
They sort of cleared the ground, philosophically speaking.
They really did. Their questioning of substance, causality, and the reliability of sense perception provided the essential toolkit for later developments. They are seen as crucial progenitors, laying the groundwork for modern empiricism, idealism, and perhaps surprisingly, even modern science.
And you have that stunning example connecting this seemingly abstract theological debate directly to 20th century physics.
Yes. It's really quite remarkable. Albert Einstein himself specifically credited David Hume's skepticism about causality. His insistence that just because A happens doesn't necessarily mean B must follow as being a significant influence on his thinking when he was developing the special theory of relativity.
Wow. So Hume's doubt about whether one billiard ball must make the other move helped Einstein doubt whether an event happening here must have an instantaneous effect over there. It broke the assumption of absolute simultaneity.
That's the connection. The philosophical work of questioning necessary connections in the observable world, which started with theological motivations in Al-Ghazali and Malebranche, and was weaponized into pure skepticism by Hume, ultimately created the conceptual space for physicists like Einstein to rethink fundamental assumptions about space, time, and causality that had reigned since Newton. The old theological debate ended up revolutionizing our understanding of the physical cosmos. It's an incredible trajectory. #outro. So just to wrap up this deep dive, we started with Al-Ghazali's powerful, scripturally rooted Islamic occasionalism, using skepticism about nature to strongly affirm God's necessary moment-by-moment creative power.
Then we tracked its journey into Europe, where figures like Malebranche and Berkeley picked up the tools to solve Descartes' mind-body problem. Malebranche kept matter but denied its power, while Berkeley went further, denying matter itself, leading to idealism, but also potentially to problems like solipsism and anthropomorphism.
Right. And then we saw Hume take that same toolkit of causal skepticism, strip away the divine conclusion entirely, and use the doubt itself as the foundation for modern empirical philosophy and skepticism about metaphysics in general.
which, in turn, prompted Kant's massive effort to rescue certainty by relocating necessity, space, time, causality into the inherent structures of the human mind itself.
And we saw why European occasionalism, despite its philosophical ingenuity, ultimately faded. It lacked that strong scriptural backing, it fought against the grain of Aristotelian thinking, and it imposed a pretty demanding theological burden on believers. It lost the immediate theological argument in Europe.
But crucially, it seems to have won the long-term philosophical war. By transforming into Humean skepticism, it fundamentally reshaped Western thought, and indirectly, even paved the way for breakthroughs in modern science.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to chew on, doesn't it?
What's that?
If modern science, in a very real sense, owes a significant debt to this philosophical skepticism about natural inherent causality, the very skepticism pioneered by the occasionalists, does that foundational skepticism ultimately undermine the idea of a creator, as Hume intended? Or does it, ironically, do the exact opposite? Does it, as Al-Ghazali argued almost 1,000 years ago, actually make the most powerful case for God? By revealing the lack of inherent necessity in nature, does it point towards a necessary, indispensable, constantly active power as the only plausible explanation for why anything happens at all? Is the universe, minute by minute, truly running on divine will?
The idea that the constant miracle isn't the exception but the rule, the only reality there is.
It's a profound question to ponder, the very foundation of science resting on a skepticism that might point directly back to the need for continuous creation.
Definitely something to think about next time you watch one billiard ball hit another, or just reach for that cup of coffee. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.